Okay, so I'm going to deconstruct and plan another essay on the lieutenant. Make sure you check out my other videos. I've done a few of these now, and also like and subscribe to my channel to support it. That would be great. Okay, so the first thing I notice when I read this question, the characters in the lieutenant are unable to escape the brutality of the situation they find themselves in. So the first thing I notice here is that I'm being asked whether I agree or not with this statement. So you really need to develop an opinion on this question, and that involves deciding whether you agree or disagree with it. Okay, let's have a look at some of the other parts of the question. This one here, the characters in the lieutenant. So when we see this, we must be sure that we don't just answer for Rook. We need to think about, and you should have with you a list of who the main characters are. I've got a little list with me: Rook, Silk, Gardner, Governor Gilbert. We've also got the convict Brugden. We've got obviously the Cadigal characters, Tagaran, Boinbar, Warungan. We've even got the character Henrietta at the end of the text. And there's possibly others that I've forgotten now. There's also groups of characters. So even though they are just a kind of a bit of a mass, we've got the convicts, and we've got the other sailors and soldiers in the Marines as well. So there's sort of groups of characters there, and the Cadigal people as a group of characters as well. So there's a lot of people in this text that we need to be thinking about when we formulate our answer and decide. And if we can find examples of characters in the text who are able, in some sense, to escape the brutality of the situations they find themselves in, then you have to disagree with the question to an extent. Okay, and I think you will find that there are some examples that you can point to where characters, in some senses, are able to escape. All right, so what are some of the other things we really need to point out here? Well, one of them is that we are talking about this word brutality. We need to look this up in the dictionary. I've already done that, and it has to do with cruel or violent behaviour. And it also has to do with a lack of empathy. Now, I want you to think about when you've heard the word brutality used. Obviously, you might have heard about it, a brutal assault. But sometimes when people say things to other people, oh, that's pretty brutal. So something that's brutal can be violent, physically violent, but it can also be about other kinds of harm, emotional, psychological types of harm. So think about, physical violence, physical harm, but also psychological harm as well, and emotional harm. Okay, so yeah, brutality can mean all of those things. So here also we've got the situation they find themselves in. Now it doesn't say New South Wales, so that means we take in the whole text. Okay, and you would be doing yourself a great disservice if you did not look at part 1 and Rook's childhood and his time as a young man, his time in the Marines prior to arriving in New South Wales, and part 5 as well. Okay, so you really do need to be looking at the whole text if we're talking about situations. Okay, the next one is this one, escape. Now, escape can mean a number of different things. It can mean physically escape, so avoid harm. It can mean like literally getting out of the way of harm. It can mean avoid, avoid being hurt yourself. It can be avoiding experiences, so witnessing experiences, witnessing. So avoiding that psychological harm that comes from seeing brutality. It can mean mentally, what you do, mental escapes. So things that you do mental escapes, like I'm thinking particularly here of when Rook witnesses the flogging and he mentally tries to take himself out of the situation. He does the same thing during the battle when he attempts to get himself out of that situation. And he also uses his mentality, his way of thinking, to deal with the bullying he experiences in part one. So think about these different kinds of escape. And I think you can also talk about escape as overcoming as well, that idea of overcoming. So how do you fix the brutality of the situation you find yourself in? How do you overcome it? Not just avoiding getting hurt, not just avoiding getting hurt through experiencing or witnessing something, but maybe overcoming it, as in standing up to it or changing things even. I think you could interpret the question to include all of those things. Okay, now I'm going to take you on to how I like to. I'm just going to actually add another page here. Insert page, a blank page. All right, and I'll move us up to that. I like to plan my lieutenant essays following Grenville's narrative arc, and that means that I have 3 ideas, and sometimes I could divide one of these into 2 and make my essay a bit longer, but I generally have 3 ideas. And my first idea is normally to consider the question, but in relation to Grenville's orientation to the text, both in terms of society and in terms of Rook's personality and character. All right, so she spends part 1 and also part 2 to a degree introducing British society, the class nature of it, the brutal nature of it, in fact, which is relevant to this question, the military. She introduces the idea of slavery and colonialism in terms of, New South Wales, but also the Americas. So she introduces all of that stuff to do with the world Rook lives in, and she introduces Rook's own character, what he is like, how he exists within a society which is hierarchical. It's a class society, and he's somewhere in the lower middle class, and there's a lack of social mobility, and so forth. So, and she introduces how his intellect helps him to process all of that and find his place and all of that sort of stuff. So somehow or another, I like to deal with all of that in my first paragraph, dealing with the orientation to the text. And I would bring that New South Wales, what that's like as well, into that. My second paragraph I like to deal with by talking about the complications that develop in New South Wales. And usually those involve the race relations there in particular. Both good and bad, both the degeneration into violence, but also the relationship between Rook and the Cadigal people, which is transformative in that sense. So I tend to deal with those in my second paragraph, and you're going to guess what the third paragraph is going to deal with. It's going to deal with the way that Grenville resolves the text in terms of Rook's moral journey and his decision to stand up to injustice. Okay, so I have this in a bit of a table here. Oh, I hate it when it does that. Hopefully it's going to stay still now. Keep going. All right, up you go. So I have this this model here that I use, and it's not perfect, but it does kind of, and I kind of have examples in this box on the side. So I've got my paragraphs here. I'm just going to get myself a pen so I can scribble as I talk. Pink? All right, I like the pink pen. That's a good one. Paragraph 1, the orientation to the text. I'm going to talk about the brutality of the bullying Rook experienced. I'm going to talk about how he tried to escape that through his interests. I might mention the observatory as part of that and how that's a part of an attempt to escape a brutal life. Talk about his life as a Marine, the hanging, the war and the battle he experienced. And I might take it into New South Wales, I think, as well, and maybe also talk about, the flogging and the parade ground, which I haven't got on this list, but it's actually on my next, funnily enough, it's on the one for the next paragraph, the parade ground. I would probably use that. So these are the kinds of examples I would deal with in this opening orientation paragraph. In my complication paragraph, I'm going to be using examples from the middle of the text. I would have also used, I've got slavery there. I would use slavery in there as well and look at the brutality of slavery too as part of the orientation to the text. Okay, in other essays, I use it in the middle paragraph. Here, I'd probably use it there. So paragraph 2, I'm going to hopefully look at the way the way that characters try to negotiate a place for themselves in the new society that they go to, New South Wales. So the way Rook and Silk try to figure things out there, and also the governor and the society as a whole, how they try to do that, but it all unravels. And the way that Rook uses his developing relationship with Tagaran to help him escape from that society, but it doesn't entirely work. And that's the paragraph on complication. I'm going to go over that in a second. I've got my examples and a topic sentence for each lined up. If it's not making sense now, hopefully it will in a second. So for the final paragraph, resolution, I'm going to be looking at those later examples, warning Tagaran, the expedition, shooting to miss, the way when Rook cleanses himself in the sea. I'm going to bring back Gardner and his experience there. I'm going to look at how Rook walks off the job and refuses to contribute to any longer, and how he confronts the governor. I'm going to look at that last bit in part 5 with Henrietta. Okay, so this is getting long, and I know I'm kind of rushing through this a little bit, but I've created some topic sentences, and also I've refined a little bit the examples I thought I would run through in each paragraph. So my first paragraph is going to argue this point here. Grenville's uncompromising critique of 18th century British society, so that uncompromising critique means she's really down on it, reveals that characters are largely powerless to escape a range of brutal experiences. All right, so here I'm pretty much agreeing with the question, but this word here largely is it's a qualified term, which means that I'm still allowing myself a little bit of wriggle room here to say that there might be some instances that they can, do something about it, but not much. And I'm going to go back into Rook's childhood, and I'm going to look at the bullying in the Naval Academy and how he tries to, and what he does in an attempt to escape from that, but that it's only really a survival mechanism really for him. I'm going to look at slavery and the British society and how it's underpinned by this brutality of slavery. I'm going to look at that whole military experience that Rook has, the hanging and the battle, the brutality of all of that, and how powerless he finds himself to do anything about that. He realises that he's trapped within it and can't do anything about it. And then I'm going to move the discussion onto New South Wales and how all of these things we've learned about the nature of the society really just play themselves out in a new place in New South Wales with some specific conditions there, but also a repetition of what's already been going on in Europe before they get there. And the main things I might draw attention to there are early in part 2, that section that deals with the parade ground and the convict people and how they're being forced to work. And I might even delve into that later example of the flogging to just bring out that brutality of that, the new convict society and what it's based upon. All right, so that's my orientation para. Orientation. I'll just get rid of that because that looks terrible. That's my orientation paragraph. I'll write it in an orange pen. Orientation. It's my orientation paragraph. Now I'm on to my complication paragraph. And this topic sentence for this one is, I'll try that colour. All right. In the colony of New South Wales, characters attempt to navigate relief from the brutality of convict life, but the realities of the situation mean that these offered only a temporary means of escape. So here I've used the word navigate relief as an idea of, I've got this idea of them trying to figure out a way around problems that they experience. There's not a lot of wriggle room in the world that they live in, but they try to figure out ways to live a good life within it. And that's what I'm trying to say here. Imagine that they're trying to find a way through. So the characters are trying to figure out a way to make their lives better within the colony. But the realities of the situation mean that these ways offered only a temporary means of escape. So here I'm using I'm again really agreeing with the question. I am saying that they try to escape, and maybe they do escape for a while, but it can't last. And so what am I going to use here? Well, I thought I'd use the governor, actually, because I think he's being represented as someone who does genuinely want to create friendly relations with the natives. And I use natives in inverted commas here, with the Cadigal people. He does, and he himself is at times diverted from the difficulties of his life by forming a relationship with Boyne-Barr, and he seems to have some real affection for him and all of that sort of thing. So he is in a sense diverted by that, and they do seem to have a genuine curiosity and excitement for what they're doing. But the reality of the situation intrudes: the lack of food, the fact that the First Nations people are terrified of them and won't have anything to do with them. And then we start to get the escalation of violence as they start scrambling to try to survive in the harsh environment. They're sending people out to kidnap people when they won't come in voluntarily. Brugden on the frontier, and obviously the escalation of violence that comes out of that. So I'd probably deal with that in a few sentences. And then I would want to talk about Silk and Rook and how they're both attempting to further their careers and interests. Again, I'd probably just give them a sentence or two and talk about how they're trying to make a life for themselves in the colony. But that this also can't last as they get repeatedly sucked back into their duties and obligations as soldiers in a system that has no flexibility at all. And then I think I'll make a big deal, so I'll probably spend half my paragraph on this point here about how Rook, Rook, and part of Rook's attempts here to further his career and interests is that absenting himself. He absents himself to his observatory so he can get out of a lot of the activities that he regards as distasteful. So that's one of his things that he does. And he genuinely, I think, manages an escape into the transformative relationship he has with Tagaran. But that relationship also can't continue. But it does really take him somewhere different that is an escape from the brutal world that he's living in. And I think I'd make a big deal out of that. And that would be kind of disagreeing with the question because he does get somewhere with that, even if it does come crashing down eventually around him, and in the end he's forced to re-involve himself in the life of the colony. And my third paragraph point is that Grenville, and I'm going to get myself a new highlighter, and this is getting long again. Why are my videos always so long? I'll choose blue. Grenville suggests, and this is my complication paragraph now, Grenville suggests that one of the worst effects of brutality is its impact on conscience, and that this can only be mitigated by standing up for what is right. I think I'll get rid of that "it" there. I'll just have to delete the whole thing to edit it. And that this can only be mitigated by standing up for what is right. Mitigated means reduced. So Grenville suggests that one of the worst effects of brutality is its impact on conscience. So I'm defining here something to do with brutality, that it is brutality hurts one's conscience, moral conscience, and that this can only be mitigated when one stands up for what is right. So I'm using the resolution of the novel here from my third paragraph. I'm going to bring back, even though it's earlier in the text, I'm going to bring back Gardner and use the effect of his sense of moral culpability, that it hurts him, his psyche. It hurts his psyche, what he's been involved in. And then I'm going to use some of those examples of Rook and the effects of his moral culpability when he doesn't stand up to the beating of Two Gear, and when he doesn't stand up at the flogging and those sorts of things. And that I'm going to use the way that he then does decide to take a stand, and how this has a cathartic effect on him and frees him from the way that he was feeling, releases that terrible effect of that brutality on his sense of moral rightness, I suppose. And then I'm going to bring in that part 5 and how his resistance, his lifelong resistance to the brutality of slavery, then leads to an escape from the mental torment that he had been feeling before he took that stand. And that's kind of how I've resolved the question there. And I'm going to stop talking now because this has got insanely long again. I hope you've enjoyed it, and yeah, like and subscribe. Bye.